Joining us in the Informer studios, the member for Bulleen, Matthew Guy. Hello, Matthew.
Go, George.
It's been a while. The last time you and I actually caught up with one another, it was an event representing the Ukrainian community in Melbourne. It was Hopak.
Hopak in the park.
That's the one. Rather wet conditions, inclement conditions, but you shone. It was one of those wonderful afternoons where you actually relaxed and got away from the sort of political responsibilities, and I could see you actually enjoyed yourself. Do you remember those days?
I love Hopak in the park. When it's been a couple of times, and my mum being from Ukraine, a Ukrainian family, obviously the sentimental link, but more than anything, it just shows Melbourne and multiculturalism. We're the home of multiculturalism in Australia, and it's why we do it so well. And when it's from a whole bunch of different communities,
correct,
having those festivals, those community events, Melbourne loved them.
And Melbourne has done them in a unique fashion for a long, long time. The member for Bulleen, you probably see a great number of different community constituents come up and ask you 1,000 questions in 1,000 different languages.
There's Italian, there's Greek, there's South African, Spanish, Chinese, Persian.
Yeah.
Look, my part of Melbourne, the city of Manningham, is one of the most multicultural, and that's part of the reason we love it.
Have you enjoyed watching it grow, mature and blossom into this more metropolis than we ever imagined it 30, 40 years ago?
I can't believe that Melbourne is a city of more than 5 million people. You know, that's a big deal on Western standards. And so any Western city, over 5 million. But it's not just that it's got 5 million people. You know, we don't have the weather of Brisbane. We don't have Sydney's harbour. Yeah. But what we do have is something unique and magnificent, and that is a love of multiculturalism. And that's what, to me, makes Melbourne the city that it is, because our best asset is our people. And that's why I think it's so important.
And it's had another religion. It's called sport. It's had a wonderful relationship with sport. It seems to me that they also used it as a furnace to get those various disparate multicultural communities invested in Victoria and in Melbourne by pushing them to play the Australian rules football rather than necessarily the round ball code. We saw the emergence of some great names. And I'm a Carlton man, and Jesaulenko to me was one of the most, it was like a magical name. Not only could he soar into the sky and take those leaps and those marks, but when he landed softly. There was none of this, stumbling, falling over stuff. No, this was Alex Jesaulenko, a multicultural wizard playing this game that...
well, George, we Ukrainians do things with style, you see. But you're right, there are names like Di Domenico, which joined names like Brereton.
Correct.
And then, of course, nowadays, you just went into names like Uze and of course, newer, Nui and others who are coming into the game.
Bashahuli, the next generation of immigrants who've come to Australia and made a name for themselves.
That's right.
How do you feel at this very difficult time? We're doing this interview in the heart of lockdown in Melbourne. The city has taken a fearful hit. This beautiful metropolis, which was for the last half a dozen years the most livable city in the world. And that's not me talking, that's what the world, the people judging it were saying. It's almost come to a standstill. It's almost a ghost town.
And it's depressing, and it's frightening, and it's unnerving.
Yes.
But one thing I do have confidence in is Melburnians. And we've learned a lot from the days of the late 80s, early 90s. And
when it was bleak.
And it was bleak.
Yeah.
And the economy was bleak, and the weather felt bleak, and everything felt bleak. The city looked grey, and we thought we had no future. Look, I do still have a lot of confidence in Melbourne as a city. We're a much more diverse city, our economy, our people, than we were even in the 1990s. And so, George, I have a very strong confidence in Melbourne as a city and its ability to recover. It's not going to be easy, and there's going to be a lot of hurt along the way. But we can get back to where we were, and we can keep advancing. I have a great confidence in Melbourne to do that.
How do we get business? How do we give business the confidence to get back and start providing those jobs, which of course bring in turn confidence and create a climate to encourage even more jobs to be built and found? And if we do that, that creates that lovely circle of how business works, and we can get this city, which was booming not that long ago, back into business mode.
I think more than ever, the state government's got to be on their side. That you've actually got to have a government that's on the side of business, that's on the side of people
But it hasn't
who
shown
want to
a
take
willingness or even an inkling that it understands not only how business is feeling, but what business actually represents.
Yeah, and
it seems to have discounted it. We'll just keep building. It's all well and good to build, but what are we building and how are we building it?
You can't build your way on a government credit card out of a COVID crisis by just government projects alone. You need the private sector to play the leading role in that recovery. And at the moment, what we have is a state government that says we will build our way out with infrastructure projects, and that alone. And that alone is not enough, George. It's not enough.
It's also very disheartening to hear some of the missteps that this state government has produced over the last year or so. But I reflect on the day that it came to office and it said it was going to, it had stood and campaigned on this platform that it was not going to build that particular roadway, and it was prepared to give $1 billion of taxpayer money to the developer in lieu of compensation because they wouldn't proceed with the project. I still haven't recovered from that.
Yeah.
How have you stood in the middle there, and you've had to work in Parliament? Admittedly, it's getting harder to work in Parliament with the rest of the constituents because you've been held back. You've been told time and time again that we're in lockdown, we're restricted. I would have thought that the last thing we were going to stop was Parliament working.
George, Parliament sat during the Blitz in London.
Yep.
If Parliament could sit during the Blitz in London, we could sit during a COVID crisis in Melbourne in 2020. You would think so. I mean, we can put in place social distancing measures. The Parliament has the ability to have a question time. I mean, we've had the ability for the media to ask questions at press conferences, for debates to be held. Democracy doesn't just stop because there's a health crisis. Yes, there is a health crisis, but we are a parliamentary democracy. Our people have elected people to be heard and to put their points of view forward.
And yet you haven't been allowed to put your hand up and talk and prosecute your case and talk to the Premier of the state and talk about some of their decision making.
And this is part of the problem we have in Victoria today. It's a
Is it
one-man
likely to
band.
change?
No, unless Labor decide to move upon their leader, then we are stuck with this one-man band, a bloke who appears to be have locked us all in a room with him having the key, and he'll decide who's in or out. I mean, I think the Labor Party have realised they've locked themselves in the room with a madman, and this guy's making all the decisions and no one else is having a say. That is not the way to run a government.
He's calling them captain's call, isn't he?
Well, whatever it is, George, it's not how you run a government in the middle of a crisis. You know, there was a war cabinet. That's how John Curtin ran it.
Yes.
The same as Churchill. You know, they have war cabinets. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, brought together a national cabinet to make decisions. But Daniel Andrews appears to be running a one-man band in Victoria. That's not how you manage a crisis. In a crisis, you take lots of different points of view and sift through them to find a way forward. You don't just say, this is it, I've decided, all bets are off. We don't even know if the curfew was put in place legally. That's going to be tested. We don't even know if some of the restrictions the government have brought in indeed are also going to be long-term, are going to be lifted in the future, or indeed if they've been legal. That's because we've had a one-man band running the show.
Before we go any further, we're going to do a second part to this conversation. I want to talk to you about the so-called roadmap out of the current lockdown. We'll talk about that in our next segment with Matthew Guy, the member for Bulleen on The Informer.